I don't care if they had a horrible event in their life. That's who they are. They've had many decision points.
There's been a lot of hostility related to me even mentioning the possibility that this isn't all just environmental adversity, that it's a good idea to educate on intentional abuse.
Why does it even matter what caused it? That's how they are. They're not changing. They know what they're doing, planned out, mapped out, chess style, because they know when not to do it. And they know when to, deploy, who to deploy around and when it's safe to do so. Come on. So who gives a rat's ass?
But no, oftentimes people get invalidated and then they get labeled something that could potentially be a side effect of the abuse as if it originated in them. So they get labeled codependent. And I think that victims are the ones who carry the shame. And I think that the perpetrators could stand to have some.
Welcome to the Brad Carr podcast. In recent discussions about personality disorders, the question arises, why did human evolution allow for the rise of dark personalities and psychopaths? My guests today have two theories of the case. Dr. Peter Salerno is a long-time psychotherapist specializing in personality pathology. His books, such as The Nature and Nurture of Narcissism, blend rigorous research with survivor testimony to illuminate the neuroscience and practical strategies that drive abuse by people of dark personality. Dr. Debra Lieberman is a professor at the University of Miami and editor-in-chief for the journal Evolution and Human Behavior. She researches how evolution has shaped the social mind. And I wanted to have them both on because their fields and their work seem to talk to each other. They feel like they're describing something similar, but in importantly different ways. And so I wanted to think through their theories and how we can better deal with people of dark personality. Peter, in the past, we have talked about the traumatic experience of people going through an abusive relationship with someone of dark personality. Why do you think it's so important that people understand the genetic roots of these personalities?
I think the main reason why it's so important is because it informs expectations of the difference between reactive and proactive aggression, the difference between, the different motivations, essentially. Why is the behavior taking place? So when we talk about genetics, we're talking about a lot of the differences among individuals are related to differences in DNA, not just what they've been through environmentally. I personally think this conversation of genetic influence, predisposition, propensity has been swept under the rug in favor of environmental determinism in my field. And not just in research, but in clinical practice. I mean, people who don't research but just practice oftentimes are quick to default to this environmentally deterministic idea of all psychology and psychopathology. So I think the conversation needs to be had about there are other factors that are just as important and oftentimes in certain cases more important.
And Dr. Lieberman, what perspective do you come at this from? What have you learned from your work on relationships, sexuality, status?
So there's two different questions. As an evolutionary psychologist, I'm interested in what are the universal features that we all possess, kind of the human operating system we all come equipped with that typically regularly develops in most individuals, and that addresses the nature-nurture question in terms of, there's got to be some type of programming in there, and then it accepts information from the social world, biological world, physical world, in order to calibrate and to develop and deploy and allows us to behave in the ways that we do. And so as an evolutionary psychologist, nature-nurture isn't necessarily the question that we start with. Nature, nurture, and genetic versus environment, that's more of the behavioral genetics, right? That's looking at to what extent are differences between individuals due to differences and variations in their genetic makeup. And so I think that clarifying the advances in evolutionary psychology and also behavioral genetics that's a good way to better understand personality and also to inform clinicians when they treat people who are exiting or in these types of emotionally abusive relationships.
Mm-hmm. And Peter, how do you see that sort of science informing clinical practice, or how would you like to see it informing clinical practice?
Well, one way is psychoeducation for clients who've endured this type of thing, because there's a lot of invalidation.
Mm.
In I would say inadvertent. It's not voluntary, and oftentimes it's not conscious. But when you are trying to provide an explanation to somebody vulnerable who's been through something abusive, and you're telling them that it's likely that the person that inflicted the harm went through something similar. So here's, when you hear that narrative, it can be very invalidating for a victim who has evidence, albeit maybe it's dissonant, but has evidence that a lot of the abuse was intentional or strategic or patterned, right? So psychoeducation for clients who have been previously informed that they somehow contributed to this dynamic, or the person wouldn't have been this way had they not been mistreated when they were 2, right? Mm-hmm. Things like that. Yeah. I think that educational component is crucial.
Yeah. And Deb, as we've discussed, you've been through this yourself. What gaps did you see in the science, in the education, the information, in your own experience?
I think there's a huge gap. So as an evolutionary psychologist, I have really enjoyed thinking about what kinds of programs have evolved over the millennia that make us human, that regulate all sorts of behaviors. My focus in the science has always been in the past, right? So what are the pressures? What did ancestral human conditions, what did that look like? What kind of problems did we have to face? And what kind of solutions did natural selection engineer to solve those problems? And so for food choice, we have a very rich food psychology that allows us to steer clear of things that were harmful. Mate choice, we prefer certain types of features and so forth. And so kind of an understanding of the basic engineering really left, at least in my own education, a gap in, okay, now look at the variety of personalities and how people actually engage. But I will say that the science is progressing quite rapidly. So now we have researchers who are interested in, okay, what contributes to the sense of entitlement, and, the people walking around thinking that other people should defer to their needs and desires. And so one of the pieces of research by a colleague, Aaron Sell, has found that ancestral indices of leverage. So if you were a guy and you were big and formidable, you could tend to get your way. People would defer to you in a variety of different ways, ancestrally, right? Or if you high in prestige and skill set and so forth, and a leader, typically you also were probably also formidable and muscular as well. But the idea is that males, for men, physical formidability would have been one personal dimension that would have caused other people to defer to them. For females, it might have been physical beauty and attractiveness, right? So there are certain types of personal attributes that might cause people to feel entitled, especially if they grow up now realizing, oh, I can get away with this, I can do this. And so that's one route into all of this. That has nothing to do with being mistreated in fact, it's just the opposite. They've been treated really well and more or less realize this is a great, successful strategy. And then you have other people who have gone through hell and are now kind of, ashamed or do whatever. Although I hope we talk about shame, because I don't know that it's necessarily shame that's driving them, but whatever. Now they're evil people and now they want to make everyone else suffer because they've suffered and they're empty inside and all this other stuff. But then again, they've got siblings who are perfectly fine and normal and altruistic. So the conditions themselves are never enough to explain the pattern of behavior. In any case, the science, so having gone through this, so like you mentioned, I was in a relationship like this, and it caught me off guard because the masks they wear are just fantastic. They're amazing. And especially if you are studied beforehand and investigated beforehand, they know it makes you tick. Like it was like this guy had the Deb Lieberman playbook and knew exactly the buttons to push. And at the time I was definitely needy. I definitely had maybe lower internal self-worth than I should have had, if I can admit that. And that caused me to have hope and really want to cling on to it and think that it was good and really hope it was going to turn out the right way. And so, but I had never encountered that type of deviousness. And, so evolutionary psychology is interesting in the sense that it really tells you about the components of the mind, but we need to kind of add to that the science of, and there are evolutionary psychologists who are working on this to be sure, the science of personality, and then how these systems deploy in a social environment. And now in modern worlds where you have people moving around and the kinds of things that were rewarding and things like that, and also screens and artificial intelligence, social media, a lot of these things could be leading more and more people down this pathway of seeing that this is a successful strategy to get what I want, and who cares about anyone else? I can step all over everyone. So a long answer to your question, but I think that there's a lot more to discover in terms of this personality type, the programs underlying them, how they develop, and what we can engineer to either inoculate people to see them. I think that's just education, or get people out of that. I mean, these are evil people, empty evil people.
Peter, do you think education is that drug that's going to inoculate us, or rather to protect us?
Is education the drug?
Yeah.
No. I mean, it'll do a lot. It'll do a lot. I mean, it was funny when you said that. I was thinking I spoke to somebody else, another a biomedical scientist, about this, and we were joking that there aren't drugs that change personalities. And he said, "Well, I can give somebody enough drugs to change their personality. It's just it wouldn't be ethical, but we can make these people stop." Technically, we just have to figure out a way to give them something that puts things into balance a little bit, and that's ethical.
Actually, I do think education is the way forward. Not for the people who are like this. To me, I think we put them all on an island and let them all kill and eat each other. That's my personal preference. But in terms of education, educating people to understand, that there's a variety of personalities out there. That's critical. And second, here's some of the ways that you can identify them. Here's some of the things that you can do. But even more important, are you solid as a person? How is it that we can shore up people's own internals so that they're never that they feel like they have the boundaries and the ability to, cut bait and run and not look back? It's not you. And if you're wrong, so what? There is no wrong in that way. And so I think that's the way we educate, and mentor people forward.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that, but I want to add to that too. Part of the education is because there's confirmation bias and there's cognitive dissonance unrelated to relationships like this. It's difficult to even explain to people and convince them that this exists. Right? That's a challenge, is to educate in a way where people are now they're willing to believe that there's a type of person out there that even if you're not suffering or you're down in the dumps, even if there's such a thing as positive vulnerability where everything's going right in your life, and then the next best thing is to find that special someone, they exploit that. They exploit you when you're on your best day. So it's important for people to know that there are human beings that exist out there that, for one reason or another, benefit from exploiting more than they benefit from connecting. They benefit from deactivating attachment while you're completely attached. I mean, I think one of the hardest things is convincing people that they have to treat different individuals differently depending on how they've come into their life and depending on all the things that Deb mentioned earlier, depending on their startup material, essentially, right?
Deb, what else do you think? It looks as though there's a little more brewing.
So as a professor at a university, I think that it's really important that we provide students with the ability to, this mentorship, to understand better themselves. Where are they in their own personal journey? But then again, understand that there are these people out there and how to deal with it. And I think that there are communication styles that can deal with them. There are strategies for being able to have a person like this in your life, even if it's unpleasant, but maintaining boundaries. And I think that learning that skill set is really important and will become more important, in this AI, social media mediated world.
Why AI and social media?
Because I think that people are going to become, the more you're attached to a screen, the more, the less face-to-face interactions you're having, the less calibrated you're getting to humans in general. I think ancestrally, we were face-to-face. If we were talking face-to-face, I would be able to take in the whole kind of all the information. So the verbals, the non-verbals, I'd see what potentially if you were sweating, maybe even smell and get some idea. All my senses would be able to collect information about you to understand the situation, how you're reacting to me personally. And that would be invaluable feedback. And it would be very certain. With good probability, I can assess how you regard me. And our interactions would be based on a very sure footing in a sense. If you were trying to deceive me, chances are I would be able to triangulate very quickly, based on, information from the elders, from the community, the family members, watch out for them. There's a lot of kind of community and social information that would have been transmitted. So I think that the face-to-face interactions allow us to understand how to communicate and how to interpret signals. And I think that with the absence of that type of training and calibration, kids from really early on are just stuck here rather than looking at faces and calibrating. And that's kind of the environment that we evolved in, is really being able to take in information from other people. But in any case, as we move further and further away from that natural environment, we're just going to be less able to read people and understand their intentions. We might be more susceptible to going with their words rather than their faces and their other body language, the body language that they're showing us. And the words are always, like, oh, I'm not lying to you, or, don't worry about this. And so I think that words are less reliable than behavior. And if we're not in front of people, we're not going to be able to read behavior as well as we have been in the past. So that's how I think social media potentially has, there are a lot of benefits to social media, don't get me wrong. But one of the downsides, to be sure, is the idea it's taking us away from in-person interactions.
Peter, what do you think? Is technology going to make this worse?
Potentially. Because I would say, if the people using the technology and designing it, and let's say people with the most clout with it, if they were collaborative, cooperative problem solvers who had the best interest of everyone, they would put regulations on it and standards and balance it out so it would be useful and healthy, and then know when to call it quits and then have the other types of interaction. But there's a lot of people who benefit from it being something that can be, again, exploited, that can be excessive, that can detach people, isolate. So it can turn into an evil in that sense. I don't know if social media necessarily would make the problem of socially maladaptive personalities any worse. I think they've done a pretty good job on their own historically of doing incredibly horrendous things. So I think it's just another way that it's going to be expressed. I don't think it's necessarily going to be the downfall or anything. We would have found another way.
I would, it's not like you could say, "Hey, Deb, go on social media, and social media is going to turn me into a narcissist or someone who suddenly like, oh my God, I can exploit people and I can like make people love me and I can do all these things and I can devalue other people." Like that no environment is going to make that an option, an attractive option for me. Right. So the idea that I'm kind of, I'm who I am and most people are who they are. And certain things are preferable versus less preferable in how I treat other people and how I'm treated myself. And so, no, I don't think that it's necessarily going to turn people who don't already have that tilt into anything they're not. I guess it's what I find is just how many people are tilted towards that direction.
So, Deb, we're talking about how things might be changing in the future. How in the past and through evolution, if we've had in the past more cues, more of a sense of tribe, how did people like psychopaths continue to exist and slip by and reproduce?
So their behavior stands out. Like the group knows. So I did some field work when I was early on, when I was first starting out as an assistant professor in a small community on an island. And and people basically pulled me aside, said, "Just be careful of that guy. He burned down his parents' house." And I was like, and I have to walk how far in the dark back to where I'm staying? Like, it was just like, these people are known. They have a little, people know who they are. So it wouldn't have been common. You're asking a really good question. And I wouldn't say that I have a definite answer. Like, I don't know with any certainty about these things. However, here's what is interesting. The systems that seem to be broken in psychopaths. And so I should say, I think that there's these names. So clinicians come up with names for these things. I, as an evolutionary psychologist, I'm more interested in if you were to open up the hood, like what weighting, what system is either, impaired, didn't develop properly, or weighted differently, individual differences in terms of how things are interpreted and so forth. And so I'm more interested in that type of programming. And so when you look at the kinds of things that people with conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder tend to have, they have high value and high regard for themselves. And the idea is that they don't really assign high value to anybody else. So that lasting value, it's very much it's almost like they meet people who could be potentially, mutually valuable. But it's like, it's in their mind, it's like not sticky enough. It's like the value tag doesn't stick. And so it's like, they just don't value people, in the same way that other people do. They see that one strategy for moving forward and exploiting people is just to kind of identify the benefits they have on offer and then squeeze and squeeze until the last drop. And then when that's done, so they do not thrive on relationships based on mutual value. They thrive on relationships of dominance and more kind of one-way sorts of things. So, and then the idea is most people see other humans as socially valuable, like just in general, like a human is a valuable individual. But if I just see you as food, right, or as prey, that's a system that's slightly impaired in the sense of I just don't assign the right type of value to you natively. And so you are just I see you as the same thing as the cow, or the chicken over there. It's like, yeah, you're moving around and boy, you look really yummy and maybe sex as well. So, it's like, so the idea that people can look at others, through a very different lens would suggest to me, and I'm talking about some of the people that, are renowned, serial killers and so forth, and we hear about them on the news, but the idea that they just look at people very differently and they regard them very differently. And it's alien to the rest of the people who have this natural regard for others and assign social value to other individuals. But that's what I'm saying. The idea that people don't even know that there's that type out there, that there's a certain type of person who just does not assign the proper social value to a human life. And that had nothing to do with upbringing. In terms of, yes, I'm sure that there could be some conditions that could forge that type of psychology, but by and large, there are people with that tendency, and that's pre-baked. That's that impairment, that setting is there from the get-go. You can observe it during childhood, during, being a toddler, all the way up through adulthood, and it just kind of grows and calibrates and develops along the way. But anyway, I'm interested in what mechanisms are broken. And I totally forgot your question right now.
So if there are people like this,
yeah.
If you can go and be doing field work and the whole tribe knows that guy is broken, and yet they still keep going on. We have maybe 1 to 10% of the population are like this?
Today. So thank you. I'm so sorry. And so evolutionarily, chances are if you rape someone, if you kill someone, and if you're constantly lying and cheating, you didn't see the next morning, right? People would have put together an alliance and really kind of taken you out back. And so I would say that a lot of people who were this type of harmful ancestrally, a lot didn't reproduce. The thing is that in each generation, you can expect a certain level of variation in the population for every single trait, right? Every single trait varies each generation anew. And so the idea that you have these more recently evolved systems for kind of moral cognition or social value or theory of mind in the sense of, how do I believe that you regard me? So I'm trying to read you as a mental being kind of thing. These more novel systems are potentially, more likely to vary and less debugged. And so there could be, you introduce new interesting variations each generation. If you wiped out all of the psychopaths and all of the narcissists in this generation, right? Next generation, it's back. Because the roll of the dice, and so genetic recombination suggests that you're going to, and with this many people roaming the earth, you're just going to end up just by the numbers with certain types of, variants. You can call them mutants. But I just mean variations. In the same way, if you got rid of, so I know this is going to, go into perhaps a different direction, but I'm often asked about homosexuality in my evolutionary psych classes. And so in the same way, even if no homosexuals or even their family members reproduced, right? And so in this generation, next generation, you're still going to have a variation in sexuality pop up because these systems are incredibly complex and so the number of systems that's required to produce one's own sexuality and then mate choice. And then you talk about internal plumbing and external genitalia. Each one of these things is guided by a different kind of system. You're going to end up with the variation anew next generation. And so ancestrally, it keeps cropping up. Now the question is, if they keep cropping up, and then if their dominant strategies and females are finding, for instance, males with these types of behaviors as attractive, as leaders and so forth, then females are selecting them as mates and having their babies. And if more really attractive females understand that they can be entitled and get what they want and people will defer and doesn't matter how they treat them, there'll be more babies, right? And so to the extent that they invest in their babies. And so I think that to answer your question in a very long-winded way, this system just perpetuates itself only because this is what you get. I mean, when you have a sexually reproducing population that's this large, you'll get variation each generation. So you tend to see it, and especially now in cultures where it's promoted.
Yeah. Peter, what have you noticed? What do you think about why there are psychopaths in the world?
Well, I agree with everything that Deb just said. I think that we talk about, when we in clinical practice as a psychotherapist, when you're doing therapy and you're treating people, that's where all those labels and criteria and things matter, mainly for coding purposes and things unrelated to, it's really just for somebody to, how am I going to treat this person that came with these particular issues? What's characteristic versus what's symptomatic? What's the,
when you say coding, do you mean like insurance coding?
Yeah, like just coding, diagnostic coding, right?
Okay.
Things that medical records, recording and things like that.
Thank you.
It's not really that important to know, if somebody is, meets the criteria for NPD with some borderline features and, it's not important for people in relationships to really know that, that is, those things are intended to describe what somebody should be treating in clinical practice, right? Because like what Deb was saying, part of it is random variation. This is a trait. And when I say it's a trait, I don't mean it's just like one trait, and then now this person just has the psychopath trait, and they're just walking around, creating havoc. It doesn't work that way at all. But basically, we can't predict how much of something somebody is going to have, and there's a lot of factors that contribute to why somebody has more of a trait than somebody else. As you know, because from our previous interviews, I think it's been overly emphasized that it's all environmental, right? So I think if you ask most people why psychopaths are walking around, they would tell you that there was some early adversity that sort of set that pathway, and then it was never buffered, and so the person just sort of fantasized until they actualized, and if they had been treated better, they wouldn't have killed those 30 people. I completely disagree with that. I think it's a bunch of nonsense, right? So it's certainly environments matter, but I would say that, just like Deb said, even if we, took all these people, put them on an island, and then the island, unfortunately, they perished because it sank, they would reemerge in future generations, because we're talking about traits, random variation, things that we don't have control of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If I can ask Peter, but therapists who are treating people, why does it matter? Why does it even matter what caused it? Who cares what caused it? That's how they are. They're not changing. And so I don't care if they had a horrible event in their life. That's who they are. They've had many decision points. They know when the look is bad. They choose, they're very careful. I mean, they're smart. They're very careful about when it is they deploy their tactics and their strategies. So come on. So who gives a rat's ass? If they develop that way, if it was a trait and a gene and they're missing the gene, so what? If they were abused as a kid, as a victim, so what? And I mean to be callous. I absolutely mean to be exactly how I sound, which is, why do therapists care? In front of them is someone who has just been abused, right? And so the question is, forget the other person, right? And so they have to deal with what's in front of them and how to actually help build up the person in front of them. And I guess that's my question. Why do therapists care?
Why do therapists care what causes abuse?
I mean, in the sense of, there's a victim in front of me. From that victim's standpoint, that victim should not care what caused the abuse. The abuse happened. Do you need any more information other than that?
Oh, well, I think the victim starts to care why it happened a lot of times because inadvertently the therapist asks them what they did to contribute to it.
Oh,
So then it becomes more of an issue of, we're going to get to the bottom of this, but there must be something that you projected or that you're trying to reenact that's unresolved, that's getting you caught in this abuse cycle, versus, yeah, those are symptoms that need to be treated. It wasn't your fault. There are certain kinds of people that do it intentionally. Other people do it in a more reactive way. But no, oftentimes people get invalidated and then they get labeled something that could potentially be a side effect of the abuse, but is being, attributed to them as if it originated in them. Like, so they get labeled codependent or highly sensitive person, or somebody who just has a bit too much empathy and needs to kind of like, tone it down, because it's their traits, their cooperative traits make them naive and gullible and stupid. And so let's work on your assertiveness and your boundaries, all the while not asking, anything related to the dynamics of the abuse, and possibly too, again, sadly, like I mentioned earlier, not believing that there's an intentionality to abuse, so that it's something that could always be conceptualized as a misunderstanding, like that was co-created.
but they don't do this to rape victims, do they? Like, if you're, I'm interpreting everything you say right now as if I were in front of a therapist.
Who doesn't do it to rape victims?
So I guess what I'm saying, a therapist would, if they were treating someone who had been raped, they would think about all the ways they might be codependent or contributing to that rape.
Yes, a lot of them. I would say generally, yes. They would also, sadly, somehow find a way to fit in an explanation that the person who was doing the sexual violence was probably mistreated themselves, and that's why they're doing it too. So they're also a victim.
So let's put those therapists on the island with the people. Gonna need a big island.
I'm telling you, Deb. Well, I mean, you would believe it. I was going to say you wouldn't believe it, but you would believe, because you're in academia and you understand how things work. Like, there's been a lot of hostility related to me even mentioning the possibility that this isn't all just environmental adversity. Like not just, hey, I disagree, but I'm going to refuse to look at counter evidence, and I'm going to devalue the messenger and the message. It's not just, I disagree. I'm in a different camp. I'm in a different tribe. I mean, it's been pretty interesting how vehemently opposed professionals are in mental health care to the idea that it's a good idea to educate their clients on intentional abuse and intentional covert manipulation.
Peter, could we get specific on what the impact has been for you in raising these issues of genes and things in abusive behavior?
It's ranged from people like in my field, many of them being like Deb, kind of like, duh, like, yeah, like, okay, that makes sense to me. I don't see any red flags there. So it's ranged from that, which is, I would say, the majority of the feedback, to more accusations of violating professional ethics, stigmatizing people, vilifying people, introducing the concept of evil into something that should remain scientific, which is interesting because I've actually never used that term. I stay away from it for that reason. But being accused of claims that I'm preaching some sort of determinism, that it's similar to making comparisons to the eugenics movement. I mean, really like bizarre like things. I'm saying that I have no compassion or empathy because I'm saying people are hardwired and there's no point in even trying to help them. Just things that I've never really said. But there's also been formal accusations and complaints officially filed against me for speaking about this type of stuff. Wow. Even when I can back it up with research and sources, it's an interesting experience because it's It's literally one person sharing a perspective that's been studied and researched extensively by other people. And then it becomes this thing of like, we have to destroy this, right? So yeah, I experienced that within the last couple of years on several occasions.
Deb, I can see you leaning forward. What's up?
Well, so there's a history in the social and behavioral sciences of emphasizing the role of the environment and thinking that the mind is more of a blank slate. And so it seems to appeal to people who believe that to be a morally more safe and safe ground, to come from when talking about. So it's an environmental determinism, which is, truth be told, just as bad as genetic determinism. Neither of which Peter and I are actually endorsing in any real sense. So the idea that genetics matters, the environment matters, and so the question is how are they interacting? But that's, to me, the question. There's so many. So the history of psychology really does come through this kind of blank slate era. So you had behaviorism and kind of these very general rules of learning. And so clinicians today were educated to really think about the mind as being this Play-Doh, right? So it's really shaped and molded by external forces. And what evolutionary psychology has shown and biology has shown us is that, no, in fact, there's a lot of content in the mind, that we come pre-equipped with a lot of structure to the mind that's ready to accept information and to learn and to engage with the world in the variety of ways that we do. And so there's a lot in there. There's a lot of content in there. Ask any engineer, you're not going to be able to, you can't get a system up and running without pre-programming, right? So, I mean, I can talk to this can all I want. I can talk to my notebook. I can talk to things all I want. If it's not actually equipped with the engineering to accept the information that it's, that I'm delivering and knowing exactly what to do with that in a non-random way, then it's not going to do very much. And so human behavior is extremely non-random. And actually, so there was a couple of points, but I just realized when I started to learn a lot about narcissism, so the word just, I hate the word because it just doesn't do it justice as to how, and I'm going to use the word, how evil these people are. You're a therapist. I'm an academic. I'm going to use evil all day long. And so, but the idea that what struck me when I first learned this, and we were talking about this, Brad, my sister was like, you need to listen to this podcast. And I was struck by how accurate this podcast had just described my situation, like down to details. I was like, oh, they know him. It was like shocking. And then the more and more I consumed about this, I've never seen such stable patterns emerge. And so from that, how is it that you end up with something that is so canalized, so organized and repeated across individuals, across space, across time, across cultures? Like, you don't get that non-randomly, right? That screams out that there's a system in there with content and that there's some organized psychology and cognitive processes that are somehow tied to genes and, of course, the development with interaction with the environment that is causing these types of behaviors. And so, in any case, psychologists who don't appreciate that there's content in the mind, so there's been a division in the natural and social sciences. So in the natural sciences, evolution matters, right? It actually structures a lot of the way we think, this mechanistic way of thinking, physics, chemistry, biology. All the natural sciences, none of the laws of physics violate chemistry, or none of the laws of chemistry violate physics, none of the laws of biology violate chemistry or physics. But all the social and behavioral sciences are all islands unto themselves, each with their own set of theories that explain human behavior. How can that be if we're a species, part of the, great tree of life, and we have the same types of origins as other living systems? shouldn't the same processes explain human behavior? And so when you come at it from that perspective, there's a lot of content in the human mind. But unfortunately, psychology and other social sciences have been slow to integrate what we've learned from biology and so not only the modern synthesis in biology, but the cognitive revolution in cognitive science. And so clinical psychology I think, has done a good job with the tools that it's had, but it's time to update that with information that's current. And that suggests that the mind is equipped with a lot of systems that are, of course, somehow tied down to genes. They get passed on generation to generation, but that can generate these types of behaviors. So I think that there's a big shift that's required in how people are educated and trained in these fields that potentially can correct things, over generations in the discipline.
Deb, earlier you had mentioned attraction to these types of people, particularly women being attracted to men who display psychopathic traits. What do we know in science about attraction and these sorts of traits?
So I'm not the expert on psychopathy. I think, folks like Kent Keel and Rob Hare, those are the ones that, and his students are the ones to bring on with that. So in terms of attraction, women in general, so making a generalization. So I don't want anyone in your audience to freak out here, but just if you squint and you were to look at mate choice, from a distance, males and females tend to find different kinds of attributes attractive, and it reflects our evolutionary past. And so it all comes down to what types of features would have limited each sex's reproductive success. So for males, what kind of features in females would have limited their ability to produce offspring? And it mostly gets tied to, health and fertility. So males who are capable of identifying females who are at peak fertility, good health, capable of bearing children, and selected those individuals as mates, they would have left more offspring and more male children, more boys who then inherited these preferences and so forth. And so males who didn't care and just mated at random didn't leave as many offspring. And so that kind of system and trait of mating at random didn't get passed along. So males tend to prefer attributes that correspond to youth and fertility. That you need not know that. That gurgles up into she's attractive. Oh, she's hot. And so it's not like you're thinking, your symmetry is this and that. You must be healthy. That's reflecting a very stable and robust underlying developmental system. And your waist to hip ratio is thus and such. And that must mean that you are in this fertile, no. And so it's just a matter of we're detecting a lot of things. And then that kind of gurgles up into an output of, attractiveness, versus lack of attractiveness or disgust and aversion. For females, and so this is one aspect of mate choice. Don't let me forget the second aspect. But for females, we have, so what would have limited a female's ability to reproduce? That would have been access to resources. So the ability to find a mate who is capable of investing in her and her offspring, the ability to invest resources. You look animal, kingdom wide, that females in most species are looking for males who have access to a territory, a supply of resources that's going to allow her to invest in, maintain health, but also invest in offspring. What corresponds with that in primates and in humans? Well, you're talking about, obviously being physically fit, being more dominant. So the larger the male, the more likely he's going to be able to ward off competitors, the more physically capable he is of, hunting and having the stamina to do all of that stuff. The bigger he is, it suggests that the longer he's been around, no one else has tried to kill him, or if they have, they haven't been successful. And so potentially that also suggests that he has more social allies. So females are looking for attributes that corresponded to, having someone who was capable of investing in her and her offspring. I should mention that one of the critical things is kindness, right? So why do women, you look at all of the studies that have been done on mate preferences, and typically some of the top preferences are like kindness and intelligence, right? So females, what's at the top isn't like money or financial prospects. That's never at the top. It's high, don't get me wrong, but it's never like the top. What usually you find is, so I'm referring to the work of David Buss and other evolutionary psychologists. It's typically, kind and smart. And it suggests that these dimensions varied ancestrally, because if it didn't vary, we don't need the preference. If you're going to get it a standard stock in every human, then you don't need to have a preference for it. It's not like there's a preference for, 10 fingers and 10 toes and like the fingernails that are like, no, that was typical stock, for most. And so, but the kindness suggests that there were people and males who were unkind, who were violent, and who were abusive. And so a female who's looking for a more cooperative mate would have done a lot better. She had a greater chance of actually staying alive, for one, and then having someone who's going to invest in her and her offspring. And so kindness and intelligence, being able to solve problems and being socially savvy, would have been critical. So those particular dimensions in mate choice, I think, make it so that today, when so much is decoupled from ancestral, conditions, that a male who's just, who looks dominant, I think that, and seems nice, it might be messing around with female psychology to say, and you're going to get a whole host of other things that come along with it. And this is a true signal in this environment. And so I think that it can definitely, it can cause problems in that sense. I mentioned the second component of mate choice. And so evolutionary psychologists have typically talked about like physical attractiveness. So men like fertility and women like resources, if you were to kind of put, make it a caricature. But there's another dimension, which is, that's just like who's hot and who's not. That's not the who cares and values me for the unique attributes that I possess. That's not like the friendship component of things. So we become friends with people because we find them, we value their unique attributes, and they value ours, and beyond sexual attraction. And so there's another component of stable mateships that I think that the individuals who are in relationships that last tend to be ones who are in relationships where they are valued for who they are, beyond their fertility or resources. And so that's a whole other dimension that goes into friendships, and strong social relationships. And that's sometimes overlooked, but I see it as really valuable, in the conversation about attraction.
So what we're getting at then is that someone with dangerous traits can present as very dominant, and then they might have pro-social skills that allow them to also present as kind, even if it's just a front?
I think so.
And that's advantageous in dating and mating?
To them, right? I mean, in the sense of if they know what other people are looking for, they know how to trick the system, right? Yeah. And then I know that once someone has bought in to the relationship, they're going to be less likely to let it go. And that's also here's an interesting question that I've often thought about, which is why is breaking up so hard to do, right? Why isn't it just like, hey, you know what? This isn't working out. See ya. I'm out. Bye. Right? Why isn't that just as easy as falling for someone? And I think the answer, again, goes back to ancestral conditions, that when you had a mate, how many mates were out there? Not many. And so when you had a mate, kind of like you dance with the one who brought you. You're there. You're with the person long term. Chances of finding another individual who's going to care about you and your well-being and the well-being of your children is going to be, it would have been rare ancestrally. So kind of making a relationship work and sticking with the person would have been a good, potentially good solution ancestrally. In modern worlds, not so much.
Peter, in your clinical practice, how do you see these systems in our biology really being used against people, or being something that people have to sort of work through in their process of healing?
How do I see the systems used against people?
Yeah.
Well, we're talking about like operating systems that are completely different in nature. I mean, to the point where it almost seems like we're not talking about the same species at times, depending on how severe. But it's disguised as something that's very normal and looks like everything else. So I see the system used as something that's covert, that mimics something very normal. And then by the time you're aware that you've been misled, all of the things that Deb just mentioned are in play, where you already have a significant attachment to the person. So it's not just a matter of, oh, this is incompatible. I don't like the way that they're treating me or the way I feel. I'm just going to leave. That's not an option. By the time the person starts to, become a little bit more lazy and let the mask slip a bit, that attachment bond is already forged enough where walking away is not just an option based on critical thinking and common sense. Yeah.
Peter, you have a real skill for describing manipulation. Could you give an example of how this is done and how people deal with it?
Well, I think so. I think that these individuals, like if we're talking about psychopaths, malignant narcissists, people that are interpersonally exploitative, I believe that they have motivations for relationships that most people just don't understand because their mind doesn't work that way. So, a lot of people will say things like, I don't feel like my partner's working on the relationship, or in fact, the partner's working a lot on the relationship, just in ways to derail it or ways to subjugate the victim who doesn't feel like there's a lot of participation. So I think what happens is these types of people rely on, whatever neurotypical or normal people, what we've collectively decided is healthy, right? They rely on people not thinking that they're any different. And so we're not entering into these circumstances suspicious. And so like a covert manipulator, somebody who's really good at looking like something that they're not, they're just going to kind of, ride that out and wait till the other automatic systems kind of adopt this person, create a representation of the person, and to the point where it's pretty shocking to the system once the person starts to realize that you've only ever heard about this person that's supposed to be great, but you've never actually met him. But you're in love with the person you've only ever heard of, right?
Deb, we had talked a little bit before. Would you like to share anything that stood out to you when you were sort of coming out of things and recognizing patterns in retrospect?
Gosh, that's a huge question. I will say something, and I think I want to speak to the people who might be listening to this because they're in a relationship like this or exiting and in a stage of exiting of some sort and recovering, which is this. I look back at 2 years of my life and I feel sometimes slightly ashamed. And I'd like to talk about shame because I'm the one feeling shame. The partner there's no shame. There was no shame. And so I feel shame because shame, and we can talk about the evolutionary function of shame, but I feel like I devalued myself. I didn't treat myself well. I really I wasn't there for me. And I think about all the things that happened. And now that I see them clear as day, I just go, oh my God. I was like, I cannot believe I cannot believe I allowed that type of boundary infraction. I cannot believe that it happened again and again. Like, what was I thinking? Because I was thinking and I was hoping and I was thinking, I don't want to rock any boats and maybe it'll go away. And so I guess one of the things that I realized is that thinking about how I treated myself makes me sad now. But what it has done, on the positive note, and this is why I wanted to share this, is that it has really made me understand each of the situations, because I think we kind of ruminate, we go back, and we kind of extract information from those situations. And I've allowed myself to do that and kind of put it in its proper place. But I've now told myself never again, like never again. Like, what was missing? What was not shored up in here that should have been, or that now is, that wouldn't allow that kind of thing? And how do I develop the communication skills and confidence to speak out and to say, hey, I don't like the way you're talking to me, and you don't get to treat me like that. And I've also learned that, like, I don't need this relationship. Like, I've got me. And that to me has been the most profound, wonderful outcome of this entire process, is that, I've learned a lot, and it's weird that I almost am grateful for having gone through it, which sounds crazy given the hell. But I'm now me. I'm now better me. I'm a better mom. I'm a better friend. I'm a better colleague. I'm a better instructor. I'm a better mentor. And I wouldn't, and I'll be a better mate one day. And I wouldn't take it back. Wouldn't take it back for the world. And so I guess reflecting on that. So if you are going through this, my suggestion is, give yourself the grace to process and keep going. Keep going. It's you live through a hell, and then it's hell to, also recover. And I think time does it. But that's one of the things. But do you mind, Brad, if we talk about this idea of shame? Because in like my deep dive during this time period, I'd hear people say like, narcissists are acting out of shame. And I'm like, what? Like, what kind of shame is that? Because when I think about it, the shame that I feel that makes me kind of lower myself and like want to repair the relationship with myself. And when you feel like you feel ashamed of your behavior in front of your friends or your family, it causes you to want to prevent other people from devaluing you and kind of repair a relationship and forge, move forward in a very different way. And so that's exactly the opposite of what people who are like narcissists, these kind of covert and malignant narcissists do. So if you want to talk about some Freudian, never to be seen, but in there somewhere possible shame, sure, go ahead. But I'm going to stay with what I know and what I can observe. And no shame produces abuse, right? And so that's anger. That's an anger, and that is a hatred. What causes people to lash out like that isn't a shame. Shame causes you to, to lower posture. It's different. It causes you to want to approach people and like apologize and, I'm really sorry, I'll do better in the future. And so I think that narcissists cause shame to occur in their victims. They're not acting out of shame. You'd see a whole different suite of behaviors. Where does that end up, both on the victim and like perpetrator side of things in therapy?
Well, there's certainly a lot of shame for the victim, because there's a lot of questions that they unfairly ask themselves, like, why didn't I catch this sooner? Or why didn't I just leave? Or why couldn't I have been stronger? Or how could someone like me, who's successful, be so naive? All these things, when they're not factoring in the reality that their ability to update beliefs was hijacked, their ability to make sense of the data was, compromised. I don't believe that the perpetrators are motivated by this unconscious shame that is so deep and profoundly like governing everything, and like putting salt in their emotional wounds all day, every day. Underneath the surface, that they're compensating by mistreating people. I don't believe that. I think that the problem with these individuals is that they don't have enough shame to put on the brake when they have decided consciously to deliberately harm somebody else because it benefits them, and they're not interested in how it affects the other person. I think the issue is too much of a willingness to believe in their unearned high self-regard, their unearned esteem, which is also another, to me, myth that they suffer from low self-esteem, and that's why they act like they have high self-esteem. Yeah, sure, if you say so. I think that they don't have what they need to treat people the way that they should. And I think that victims are the ones who carry the shame. And I think that the perpetrators could stand to have some, and then that might be something that's a bit more motivating to change than all of the self-justification that they do. So I'm on an island with that belief that narcissists aren't compensating for this deep, profound, hidden shame that they avoid all day, and that's why they act out.
To therapists' credit. So if I had to if I had to say something nice about the therapists that you just talked about, who are talking about perpetrators as having this kind of internal, shame that causes them to do this, I would say that's a reflection of the fact that therapists themselves believe that they're dealing with people with a full deck, right? So if you don't know, if you've never interacted with someone like this, and you just have one kind of model of human nature and what people are and how people are, and you as a therapist or someone I know that when I feel I would want to grow, and there's always a reason why I do these kinds of things and want to repair a situation. I think it's a reflection of the fact that therapists are playing from the same playbook, which is a normal psychology, right? So their own psychology that brings them into people can grow, people can change. It's the environment, and they're therapists. So that I think that's a natural, interesting thing. But in my book, it's not shame at all. I think it is when I reflect back on some of the earliest conversations, like first date conversations. It's laced with anger. It's like, I cannot possibly believe that other people have gotten further than me just because they're tall, dark, and blonde, or handsome, whatever it is. Like I'll show the world that I can screw with them all and dominate. And so I heard anger. It's laced with I'm going to show all of you. There's no shame there.
It's more of a contempt and a spite. And that gets aggressive and hostile, right? They feel like people's, they move quickly from idealizing something or admiring something outside of themselves, and sometimes in someone else. They move quickly to wanting it, coveting it. It's good for a time. Even the things that attracted them to you are good, but then it doesn't last very long before they devalue and spoil and destroy those things. So even the things that drew them to you, that they find appealing, they eventually have contempt for. So it's more, it's like you have to understand that they are. It's a completely different operating system. The things that motivates them, it's not the pro-social emotions that motivate the three of us, where we enter into something for, in a reasonable fashion. They think they're being very reasonable by entering into relationships for transactional purposes. They can't for the life of them understand why everybody's so sensitive. But it's just really important to remember that, we're dealing with people that do not think and feel the way you do, and they're not motivated by shame. And they're certainly not motivated by shame in the sense that they're going to compensate for this shame that they don't even know they have, so much so that they're going to turn into a completely shameless person. That just doesn't make sense. All those theories, by the way, are anecdotal and speculative based on talking to people who pathologically lie. And so, of course, they're going to say, yeah, I mistreat people because I was mistreated. Of course they're going to say that, especially when you're already wanting them to say that, because that's what that's the theory you studied in school and you want it to be correct. You're going to look for it, right?
What is the glitch with using anecdotal evidence? I mean, it seems like with these situations, if you get people in a therapist chair and you get them talking, then that might be the tool that you have.
I'm not saying that it's not useful. I mean, you can observe and if someone's telling you their story, there's all kinds of things that could come from that meaningly come from somebody sharing their story. For example, they're sharing their story, but they're sharing their psychology. So there's a lot that is useful by just speaking to somebody about themselves. The problem is jumping the gun and saying that, well, because we know that parenting is the main ingredient related to all mental health, psychopathology, intelligence, everything, because, they just, shape this blank slate. If there is adversity in this person's story, it's going to make sense to me why they're so, unfaithful, or why they're so deceptive, or why they're so it's a problem to just assume cause by the story that they're telling. And that's mostly what happens, especially when we talk about personality disorders. Personality disorders are like this distinct classification for good reason. They were exiled originally too, because no one knew what to do with them, because they didn't respond to any of the normal standard treatments that were working for other conditions. So they were this exiled thing, but they're being treated and conceptualized clinically for the most part as trauma-related conditions or stress-related conditions. That these are episodic, symptomatic conditions, and the only time the person is being arrogant is when they're actually experiencing insecurity. The only time the person is devaluing is when they're actually experiencing low self-esteem. The only time the person is mistreating others is when their self-concept and self-appraisal is low. That's not true, but also it doesn't matter whether or not it's true at this point, because it's so powerful, because it's the general consensus. It's not fading away anytime soon.
So, Peter, I have a question for you. While you were just talking, I'm always trying to think about analogies that get it out of, that take it away from the topic of like narcissism and psychopathy and stuff like that. And so I just came up with, we've talked about some in the past, but I want to try a different one out that's less politically charged. So there's people who come into this world who have very strong kind of like physics sides of their brains. Like they understand the world in terms of mechanics and how things actually, like the Newtonian push and pull and so forth. Those tend to be our engineers, right? Engineers who kind of see how things get put together and how, cause and effect and so forth in a very mechanistic sense. And so we would say that those people have a very kind of strong, theory of bodies and theory of physics and so forth. And so in the head, there's circuitry that allows us to understand the behavior of people, of animate and inanimate events. And we could choose to use our, physics module in order to understand cause and effect. Like there has to be a lever in there that's causing a movement, right? And the reason why the pen fell is gravity, but then there's theory of mind. So, if I were to hold this pen up and I say, why does the pen fall? Gravity. Like there is an actual force, there's a mechanism, even though it's hidden. You wouldn't say it was tired, it wanted to go to sleep. And it felt that by laying down on the table, it would feel like it could fall. Like those are all theory of mind, beliefs and desire psychology. And some people are just born better equipped with understanding the world in these kind of immaterial, like non-physical, metaphysical sense, right? And so those tend to be our artists and people who believe more in feelings and and those tend to be like the anti-biology. So this was reflected in C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures. Like you have people who are just more kind of mechanistic and gearheads versus people who are more the feeling and like, no, you explain things because there's souls and there's beings and there's mental states and there's desires and beliefs. And so we have these systems in our head, but for any given individual, it could be, maybe you've got both operating and both kind of at, both deploying to equal extent. But some people have, certain systems that are dominant. And so again, engineers versus artists, if you will. So poets versus engineers. So, hopefully I'm not saying anything that's super strange to people, that people definitely differ in how they think about the world. But here's the point when it comes to the psychopathy and narcissism. there's nothing in the environment that's not like the engineer became the engineer because they were deficient in, and in the ability to understand, like they weren't bathed in a social world where people were talking about theory of mind. It's just, no, their mind is geared towards being more predisposed to thinking about mechanisms. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why I enjoy evolutionary psychology in the way that I do, is because I love thinking about, well, how does it work? What's the engineering? Like, if I was an information processor, like, how would I organize it? Like, how would I have it, structured? And so that for me is interesting when it comes to mental phenomenon. But other people are like, you can't do that in biology. No, it's all feeling and it's all just gets in there somehow. And it's general purpose. And we don't have to worry about that stuff. It's just, and their beliefs all metaphysical. And so, well, my point is, these are innate differences between people. These are differences in like how people come into the world and their settings and how they choose to, and what preferences and their, what feels good as explanations. No one would argue with that. Well, I don't know very many people who'd argue with that, given like the individual differences on those levels. Like, that's exactly what we come across with people who care about others, and have the empathy, and those who don't. It's like the very same kind of setup. It's like you come preloaded with these preferences and ways of interacting and dealing with people. Like, the idea that everything is a transaction is foreign to my mind. Like, no, not everything's a transaction. I can do things unconditionally without it being a transaction. But someone who is purely transaction heavy is going to be like, well, why would you ever do anything for free? Why aren't you monetizing everything? Why isn't everything a quid pro quo? And so it's just, to them, it's going to sound very strange. And to my ears, it sounds very strange to kind of walk through the world like that. But that's the same way that engineers and poets might not be able to sit in the same room and have a meaningful conversation, because one's like out there and one's like in the details. And so, I mean, that to me should make sense to most therapists. And so that model seems to suggest there are inherent differences between individuals that are exactly like that. So that was the idea that I just came up with. I don't know if that makes any sense. Validate me.
Well, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Validate my idea. Yeah, I mean, I think that's silly that therapists don't think that people come upset.
I think another thing too is that people, when you're like, as a therapist, you go to school and you get thrown into a practicum. They just throw you in, you start talking to people and you start learning things. And you're typically not going to think, at least naturally or instinctively, you're not going to go, I wonder how many people are showing up and they're actually not planning to collaborate today.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't even occur to them that someone would take the time to pay to tell a story that's insincere so that they don't get better, because it hasn't been put in their mind that there are people who, even when they can tell the truth and it benefits them to do so, will still choose to lie. They haven't been taught that there are people who work that way, where it seems unbelievable, because I don't know if you experienced this with the person that you referenced earlier, but in previous relationships with individuals that I would describe as having some pretty socially maladaptive traits, like the idea that anything was done on purpose, like, didn't ever occur to me. Like a sabotage or like something like that. Like the idea that they could be thinking that they're going to create drama to destroy this, but they're actually saying and doing things to feign like they're really trying to work it out. I'll stop there.
No, it's impressive. It's impressive. It's impressive. But once you now know that there are those types, that the word salad is impressive, and then the confusion that sets in. But if I may, so Brad, Peter and I are talking a lot about how to help people think through their trauma. And certainly one of the things that has helped me was just thinking about, like, for a given behavior that you now see, like, what's the likelihood that someone who's actually kind does that? like if your bestest friend, like if they really cared about you, how likely do they do that? like in the perfect world, would a best friend be expected to do something like this? Would a mate be expected to do something like this? A family member? And then it gives you like an outsider's perspective, like, oh, no. In fact, no, that's actually really odd. I shouldn't be confused leaving a conversation. In fact, I have lots of conversations and rarely do I leave them confused. But this one, I'm always confused. And so just thinking about like what is a perfect relationship? Does it leave you? Would it cause you to feel this way, believe this way, and ponder and and basically rethink about the situation as much as you're thinking about it? And the answer is no, typically. Normal relationships don't cause you this kind of angst and mental anguish and effort.
Yeah. What I've seen in my own experience was that the man I dealt with, he would push that boundary a little bit, and then he would come back with something really nice and cover over it. Mm-hmm. And so that would become a new baseline. And then he could push it a little further the next time, but then cover over it. And our last conversation was the most strange, confusing, manipulative conversation. It was the only time he's ever yelled at me. It was like he had to pull all the levers to see if he could set the baseline again. And that was the one that brought the end of it. So I can see how it can happen, how something that doesn't seem normal can slowly over time become the norm.
Mm-hmm. That boundary is important, so I think that the boundary, so predators, I'm always reminded of like Jurassic Park when you hear like the scene where it's like they're testing the fences. Yeah. it's like, yeah, like predators, they test the fences, and and to a normal, whatever. And so, but the idea is like, oh, but they don't mean anything. They would never harm me. They don't mean anything. Like, why would they ever, cause I would never do that. So why would anyone else think to ever do that? But the idea is like, no, that's exactly but I never test anyone's boundaries. And so the idea is that, or at least I don't do so in a manipulative fashion. I'm like, I can't say I never test anyone's boundaries. But at the same time, testing boundaries and then exceeding them and pulling back. I mean, they're very smart. That's the thing. They're so crafty and they know what works and they know what doesn't work. It's impressive.
Yeah. Well, Deb, earlier you used the phrase shoring up. Maybe we could talk a little bit about, Peter, how you work with people on that shoring up. And also the two of you have a shared project that maybe we could talk about a little too, just to close things out. But first, where's the best place for people to look for each of you online? How about Peter first?
I have some books on Amazon that I wrote. I have a website.
Got my stack of Peter Salerno books.
Oh yeah, here you go. Yeah. So there's my website's drpetersalerno.com, and then I'm on Instagram as well, and YouTube. Yeah.
You're not doing a good enough job. And tell me, what's the name of your last book?
Okay, so there's Cruelty by Nature. There's
Cruelty by Nature.
Traumatic cognitive dissonance, nature and nurture of narcissism. And then me and Deb have some good news about some future projects as well. But I'll let her tell you where to find her.
But I have to just say something about the Cruelty by Nature one, because I think it's really important. I read it and I thought it's a great book because it identifies, again, the fact that they know what they're doing, planned out, mapped out, chess style. And it's because they know when not to do it and they know when to, deploy, who to deploy around and when it's safe to do so. And it's so consciously present in their mind as to what they're up to. Again, the idea that what Peter said, the different operating systems. So I can say I definitely I've enjoyed Peter's books, and it's been one of the things that has helped me think through it. The traumatic cognitive dissonance. Where can you find me? I have a website, Lieberman Labs. And so right now I'm at the University of Miami and the Department of Psychology. And so right now Lieberman Labs is the website that gets to some of my stuff and podcasts and papers. But So one of the projects, though, that Peter and I have going on is a workbook that we are trying to roll out soon. Now you have me hesitant about telling when, but the idea is, I think that you can start looking for it towards the end of March on Peter's website for sure.
Right.
So the emails will start rolling in. But
work.
yeah, no, we have lots of work to do. So it's, check back, but it's a workbook to help people think about their relationships and how to process it and how to come out of the fog. And so it's meant as a tool to help people think about the events in a way that will rebalance and get them to be more confident in their own assessment, but also just kind of have an objective point of view as to what happened, divorcing it from any emotional attachment and really thinking about it as dispassionately as possible in order to kind of move forward. So is it going to cure anything? No. But I think that thinking in this way, I know it helped me. And this is why kind of Peter and I hooked up on this project, is because no one's thinking about better ways of thinking and moving through this process. But I'll let Peter say a little bit more because, he brings the clinical and the therapy side of things.
Mm-hmm. All right. We'll put links in the description for people to check out all those resources you both mentioned. And then Peter, yeah, please share.
Well, I just want to say regarding the workbook, I wish I had a tool that, like, kind of what we're incorporating in it. I wish I had that when I was going through this, because there are very few, ways to make sense of what actually happened. When you're trying to recover initially, you're still kind of disoriented. I mean, most people's experience that I've spoken to is they're still disoriented, bewildered. There's a lot of self-doubt. It's hard to know how to make sense of what happened, interpret it. The way that we're designing this workbook is it takes all of the effort that you would put into that out of it, and it's very clear. There's and not to give a lot of it away, but there's things in it, like stopping rules and things to prevent rumination and other things that I think that we've done a really good job of, like, trimming the fat, so to speak, on what actually you need to do and what you can manage to do when you're trying to first start to make sense of it. So it's exciting. Yeah.
Deb, would you like to highlight anything else about it?
No, I'm exactly what Peter said. I'm really excited about the tool, and the aim is really just to, identify with people who've been through this and to help them on their journey. I mean, I think that people who are targeted and get ensnared in these types of relationships, they tend to be really good people. They're full of empathy, they're full of drive, they're full of motivation, they're doers. And I think that, giving those folks the tools to realize, like, I can get through this. And I think that I'm hoping it's helpful to them in the way that it's been helpful to me and thinking about it with Peter.
Yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. To both of you for the work that you do from different angles on this topic to help people understand, and for the courage to collaborate and to talk together and to cross those different fields. Thank you so much for doing it, and thank you for taking this interview with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks for having us.